Hey guys, welcome back. If you remember last week's video, I reviewed the NiSi V6 filter system because I recently purchased the 10-stop neutral density filter. And I also got to thinking, let's not just review these filters, but let's actually show you how these filters will affect your photos. That way, when you want to go out and take landscape photos of the city, the waves, the ocean, the river, whatever it may be, you have an idea of what sort of filter to use and how it will affect your photos as well. Plus, if you stay to the end, I'll also show you how you can use NiSi's app to determine what your shutter speed would be once you add a neutral density filter onto your lens as well. I just want to quickly say that before I actually show you the pictures and explain how these filters will affect your photos, I do need to point out that in order to be able to do this accurately, you have to put your camera in manual mode. That way you can set the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed all yourself instead of relying on the camera to do it. Because also by doing that, by fixing your aperture and your ISO, that way the only variable that's changing is your shutter speed once you've added a neutral density filter on top of it. If you put it into something like auto or aperture or shutter speed mode, you're letting the camera decide everything for you except that one particular mode. Well, unless it's auto, then it chooses all of it. So by putting the camera in manual, you can then set the ISO and the aperture, leave them as is, and then that way all you have to do is change your shutter speed, and then you can see exactly how these filters will affect your photos. Now, this is my base photo that we're going to be using for this example. Compositionally speaking, I know it's not the greatest. You normally don't put something right in the middle unless you're going for reflections, which in this particular case you can't. But I wanted to have an equal amount of the sky and the river in the photo, as well as some of the building, so that way you can see how using the filters, especially the polarizer, which I'll get to next, will actually affect the colors in the photos and the way that it's going to look. So whilst it's not great compositionally for this example to show you exactly how it's going to work, it does come in handy. Now, this is the base picture that we're going to start with. The settings that I've put the camera at is 24mm on the lens, ISO 50, and my aperture is set to f13. Due to the time of day that this was, I deliberately went out in late morning when the sun's a bit harsher. It's not golden hour or blue hour, but at least it's definitely not noon or early afternoon when the sun's the harshest. And I was able to get a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. And moving forward, the only thing that's going to change once I add these filters on is the shutter speed. I'm not going to change the ISO, the aperture, or the focal length. That's all going to stay the same so that you can see exactly what these filters will do once you add them in front of your camera. Now, the first picture we're going to look at is the Circular Polariser. And I just want to quickly say that when you do add this in front of your lens, bear in mind it can take away 3 stops of light from your photo. So if you're shooting like 1/100th of a second, this could slow it down to 1/25th of a second just by adding it on and applying the polarization effect to your photo. So just bear that in mind. You can compensate for it by either extending your shutter speed or opening up your aperture for a wider one. But then if you don't have a stabilization like my Canon doesn't, or you're worried about losing depth of field, it's just something to be aware of that you may get a darker photo you'll have to fix in post to get the same exposure than if you didn't have a polarizer on there. So for the polarizer, I've actually got 2 separate examples I want to use to show you because they do have quite a bit of an effect on your photos, and it's something to always bear in mind when you're using them. And on the first one, you can actually see the reflection of the sun on the water quite a bit. That's why it goes green and then very bright after that. But then also the water on the rocks themselves from where the waves were hitting it after the river cat goes through. There's also quite a bit of reflection on there. And also, you can't really see through the water too much to the rocks below. You normally can't since the water's not that clear, but you'll see what I mean once we add the polarizer to it. Now this photo, I have applied the polarizer to it and I've turned it as much as I could. And you can actually see there's a stark difference compared to without the polarizer. The color of the water is consistent all the way through. There's no reflection of the sun on the water, and even on the rocks themselves, it's not reflecting on the water on the rocks. But also the color of the rocks has changed a little bit at the same time. And you can actually see through the water too. So there's 4 different things that have changed in this photo just by applying a polarizer to it. You've got the same color on the water all the way through instead of reflections of the sun. You can actually get rid of the reflections of the water on the rocks, but the rock color has changed a little bit, and you can actually see through the water a little bit. So this is where having a polarizer can come in handy, because as you can see between the two, once you've applied the polarizer to it, you've got the same consistent color on the water because you've taken the reflection off the water itself. And even the water that's on the rocks, there's no reflection on there anymore either. But you do have to bear in mind that it has changed the dry rock color because it's gone a little bit darker and the colors pop a little bit more. So whether you like that or not is personal preference, but it's just something to be aware of. But one other great thing is that you can actually see through the water a little bit more. Granted, the water's not very clear, so in this case it's not that visible. But if you're in like the Rockies and you want to shoot on the lake and the water's very still because you want to capture the rocks underneath, then having a polarizer is something that will enable you to get those rocks that are below the water level, because to try and replicate that in post, it's damn near impossible to do any of these except change that rock color. But the rest of it, the removing the glare, removing the reflections, seeing through the water, I don't know how you can do it in post. I've tried researching it and everyone says it's damn near impossible. Just get the polarizer and save yourself the time. It's a couple $100 for the polarizer versus hours on end trying to fix it in post, which you're going to be doing every time you take a photo that involves water. So just get yourself the polarizer. Now this is going back to the base picture that we were using earlier and that we'll continue using moving forward. And this shows how it looks with the polarizer on. As you can see, the sky is a little bit darker, it's a little bit bluer. But if you look at the water, the actual color of the water has changed a little bit as well. And that's because you've taken the reflection of the sun off it. But by applying the polarizer to this picture, I did have to slow my shutter speed down to 1/40th of a second, which is like 1.5 stops. So it's not the full 3 stops I mentioned earlier. But as I mentioned though, it is something to bear in mind that it can be up to 3 stops depending on the actual polarizer that you've got. So this is how it looks with the polarizer. This is how it looks without. Which one you prefer is down to personal preference. I almost always enjoy using a polarizer when there's water involved because it does take that reflection off, but sometimes you do want the reflection, so there's no right or wrong in this case, just like with everything in photography. Now that we've covered the polarizer, which did take a little bit longer than expected because I did want to make you aware of exactly how polarizer can affect your photos, we'll now go through the 3, the 6, and the 10 stop ND filter. I have left the polarizer on for all of these photos as well, so that way at least you've got consistency between how it looks when it's polarized, a 3 stop, a 6 stop, and a 10 stop, and that way you know exactly how it's going to look. Now the next filter that we're going to cover is the 3 stop neutral density filter. And when I did add this in front of the lens, I did have to slow the shutter speed down from 1/40th of a second down to 1/4 of a second. It may not be exactly 3 stops because I'm playing it by ear, and well, when I say playing it by ear, I'm actually how it looks on the back of the camera through the viewfinder, and that's the closest that it looks to get from 1/40th of a second to 1/4 of a second according to the light meter in the camera as well. By slowing it down, you do see that the water in the river has smoothed out a little bit, not drastically compared to 1/40th of a second, but it has smoothed it out a little bit, and that's probably where you notice the most difference because the clouds weren't moving that fast, so even at 20 seconds that you see later on, there's not that much difference. If you look at the water between 1/40th and 1/4th, there is a little bit of smoothing out of it, but not that much. Depending on the look you're going for, that may be enough for you, or it may not be enough, or it may be too much. It's literally down to you as to how you want to apply it. And after the 3 stop, we've got the 6 stop neutral density filter. And when I added this in front of the lens, instead of the 3 stop that is, I had to slow my shutter speed down from 1/4 of a second or a quarter all the way up to 2 seconds or down to 2 seconds. And by doing that, I was able to smooth the water out quite a bit more. I mean, there were also no river cats going through to disturb the water. So by doing it, you can see that the water is a lot smoother now in comparison to 1/4 of a second. But depending on the look you're going for, that still may be enough or it may be too much. It's down to what you're trying to capture on that particular day. So in cases when you're shooting at the time of day that I was, which was just before lunch actually, and you wanted to try and smooth out the water a little bit, a 6 stop filter may come in handy because it does smooth out the water to give it that silky look, but it's not overly smooth that it looks completely flat or still quite choppy as if you're doing it handheld, and you can see all the ripples in there as well. So with the 6 stop filter during the day, you can slow it down quite a bit, but remember to bring that tripod with you, otherwise you're going to get a very shaky photo in the process as well. And last but not least, we've got the 10 stop neutral density filter. Now when I put this in front of the camera, I had to slow my shutter speed all the way down to 20 seconds because that was the only way I could have been able to get the exposure correctly compared to the other photos and what the camera was saying was accurate. And by doing that, I was able to smooth out the water very well. It got that smooth, silky look that I often like to have on rivers and whatnot. If I'm shooting waterfalls on the ocean, I wouldn't do 20 seconds, but it's something that you can do whilst you're out there in the field instead of having to take multiple images and worry about fixing it later in post, so to speak, because you can just put that 10 stop neutral density filter in front of your camera and you know you're pretty much going to get a smooth look depending on the time of day you're shooting and what your shutter speed's going to be. One cool picture I was able to get out of it as well is this one of the river cat going past, where you can actually see it's got that long shell to it, which I wouldn't have been able to do during the day unless I used that 10 stop filter because I had that 20-second exposure. If I had a 2-second exposure like with the 6 stop, it just wouldn't have looked as good as using the 10 stop. So that's where using a 10 stop comes in handy, is you can be more creative with your shutter speed during the day instead of having to wait for golden hour or nighttime to get that slow shutter speed to it. Now in this instance, I didn't actually take any pictures using the natural night filter. One, because it wasn't at night, it was 10, 11 a.m. in the morning, but also if it's meant to be used when you want to reduce the glare from things like street lamps, or when I did my test with it, it was on the lights on the Harbor Bridge, which if you want to see exactly what the comparison is, I'll put a link to that video down below so you can go check it out as well. But this is something that when I am back in the city now that lockdown has lifted, lockdown's finally over, I can go and test this out a little bit more in the city and see if I actually like how it affects the photos or not. So there's not going to be any of that today. Now that we've looked at all of the filters and how they can affect your photos, you might be wondering, how are you going to know what shutter speed you're supposed to use once you use a 3, 6, or a 10 stop or whatever stop filter that you've got on hand? Now there's two different ways you can do it. One way is you can extend your shutter speed until the picture looks right and you've got it exposed properly based on what your camera is showing you on either the LCD screen or through the viewfinder. Or you can actually go and download NiSi's app, which is free on both iOS and Android. And remember, I'm not paid by NiSi to promote them. It's just I do really like their products. That's why I buy them and use them. But they do have an app that you can use, which lets you put in what your current shutter speed is, how many stops your neutral density filter is, and what your resulting shutter speed is supposed to be based on your neutral density filter. So as an example, let's say with this one, I was supposed to use 1/200th of a second, and I want to put on a 10 stop neutral density filter to go extreme, and it's telling me that my shutter speed should be 5 seconds. But at the same time, you can also put in an 11 stop, 12 stop, or you can go down and put on a 6 stop instead, and it's telling you that your shutter speed should be 3 seconds. It came in handy for me because I was once doing photos where my shutter speed was 8 seconds. I put a 6 stop neutral density filter on there, and it told me that I needed an 8-minute 32-second shutter speed to get the exact same exposure. And this does come in handy when you want to do long shutter speeds, because when I was taking this picture of the star trails above Sydney Harbour Bridge, I knew I needed that for a base exposure. I needed 8 seconds, but I didn't want to have to take a photo every 8 seconds using a 2-second timer. I knew it would take gaps. So I wanted to use the 3-stop filter, and by using this app, it told me I needed to do 1 minute instead. And by doing that, I was able to play around with it and test it to see if it was accurate or if I needed to adjust it accordingly. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and now you can see how using either a polarizer or a neutral density filter will affect your photos, especially when it comes to the shutter speed for the neutral densities and the colors for the polarizer. If you do have any questions about these filters, please leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I also just want to say, at the time this video is going live, we are finally out of lockdown. So fingers crossed, my next video, I'm going to actually be out there taking photos, weather dependent naturally. But I'll stop rambling for now because I do want to get out of here. I do want to go take photos. So I'll see you next week. Have a good night.